The other pilots called him Farmboy, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. James Jabara stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, had dirt under his fingernails from years of working wheat fields, and spoke with a flat Kansas accent that made the East Coast Academy graduates smirk. He was 21 years old in the autumn of 1944, fresh out of flight training, assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron of the 357th Fighter Group in England. And he was about to prove that growing up on a farm taught you things about machinery, about physics, about survival that no academy ever could. Jimmy had been born in 1923 in Muskogee, Oklahoma, but his family moved to Wichita, Kansas when he was still a child. His parents were Lebanese immigrants who had come to America looking for opportunity and found it in the wheat fields of the Great Plains. They bought a small farm, worked it hard, raised 4 boys who learned early that survival meant understanding how things worked: tractors, combines, windmills, irrigation pumps. When something broke, you didn't call a mechanic. You fixed it yourself, or you starved. Jimmy was the second son, quieter than his older brother, smaller than his younger ones. But he had a quality that his father recognized early. He understood machines intuitively. Give him a broken engine and he'd sit with it for hours, taking it apart piece by piece, studying how each component related to the others, rebuilding it until it ran better than before. His hands were always greasy, his clothes always smelled of motor oil, and his mind was always working through mechanical problems that others found baffling. When he was 16, Jimmy saw his first airplane up close. A crop duster had made an emergency landing in a field near their farm, and Jimmy had run the 2 miles to see it. The pilot was checking the engine, cursing at a fuel line that had come loose. Jimmy watched for maybe 10 minutes, then quietly pointed out that the vibration was coming from an improperly balanced propeller, and that's what had shaken the fuel line loose in the first place. The pilot looked at this skinny farm kid and said, "You ever think about flying?" Jimmy hadn't, but the question planted something. He started reading everything he could find about aviation. He haunted the small municipal airport in Wichita, doing odd jobs in exchange for being allowed to watch the mechanics work. He learned how aircraft engines differed from tractor engines, how control surfaces translated stick movements into 3-dimensional motion, how airflow over wings created lift through pressure differentials that he'd never heard of in school but understood instinctively because he'd spent years watching windmills catch prairie winds. Pearl Harbor happened when Jimmy was 18. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces the next day, lying about his age by 6 months because he couldn't wait. His parents were terrified. They'd left Lebanon to escape war, and now their son was running toward one. But Jimmy was determined. He'd found something that combined everything he loved: machines, speed, problem-solving, and the 3-dimensional freedom that a farm boy watching hawks circle wheat fields had always envied. Flight training was supposed to wash out 60% of cadets. Jimmy didn't just survive it, he excelled. His instructors noted that he had an unusual feel for aircraft energy management, for understanding exactly how much altitude and speed he could trade for maneuverability, for knowing when an engine was about to stall before the instruments showed it. "Flies by the seat of his pants," one instructor wrote. It was meant as criticism. Real pilots flew by instruments. But Jimmy's seat of the pants flying came from thousands of hours, understanding how machines responded to stress, to fuel mixtures, to temperature and pressure changes. He earned his wings in March 1944, received his commission as second lieutenant, and was assigned to P-51 Mustangs. The Mustang was the best fighter in the American arsenal. Fast, maneuverable, with range that allowed it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It was also temperamental. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was powerful but required careful handling. Pilots who didn't respect it could overstress the engine, overheat it, destroy it. Jimmy respected it. He spent hours studying the technical manuals, learning every system, every limitation, every quirk. While other pilots were drinking in the officers' club, Jimmy was in the hangar talking to mechanics, learning how to read an engine's behavior from sound and vibration patterns. In September 1944, he shipped out to England. The 357th Fighter Group was stationed at Leiston, a former RAF base in Suffolk. The 357th had a reputation. They'd been in combat since February, had produced several aces, and had high standards. New pilots were expected to prove themselves quickly or be quietly reassigned to less demanding duties. Jimmy's first impression of his new squadron mates was that they were nothing like him. Most were college-educated. Many came from wealthy families. They had easy confidence, insider jokes, shared references to places and things Jimmy had never experienced. They wore their uniforms with casual elegance. They spoke in the clipped, sophisticated tones of men who'd grown up assuming the world was theirs. And they took one look at Jimmy, short, skinny, with his flat Kansas accent and his habit of talking to maintenance crews like they were his equals, and labeled him immediately. Farmboy. It started as a joke, but it stuck. It became his squadron nickname, used with varying degrees of affection or contempt depending on who was speaking. "Hey, Farmboy, you know how to work a flush toilet, or should we show you?" That from a pilot from Connecticut named Bradford who'd gone to Yale before the war. "Farmboy, the mechanics aren't your friends. You don't need to spend so much time in the hangar. It's unseemly." That from the squadron operations officer whose father was a congressman. Jimmy didn't respond to the jokes. He just kept doing what he'd always done, learning, watching, understanding. He noticed things other pilots missed, like how Captain Mitchell's aircraft was burning oil slightly rich, and how that meant his engine was going to fail soon if the mixture wasn't adjusted. Like how Lieutenant Hensley was pulling too much negative G in his dives, and how that was going to cause structural failure eventually. Like how the squadron's tactical doctrine assumed enemy fighters would always be faster and more maneuverable, when actually the P-51 had specific energy states where it could outperform German aircraft if flown correctly. He tried to share these observations once during a briefing. The squadron commander had listened politely, then said, "Thank you, Lieutenant Jabara. We'll take your suggestions under advisement." Translation: "Shut up, Farmboy. The adults are talking." Jimmy's first combat mission was on October 12, 1944, an escort mission for B-17 bombers hitting industrial targets in western Germany. The 357th provided high cover while the bombers made their runs. No enemy fighters appeared. Jimmy flew his assigned position, followed orders perfectly, and returned to base having seen nothing but clouds and distant flak bursts. His second mission was 3 days later, more of the same. Bombers in, bombers out, no contact. Other pilots complained about the boredom. Jimmy studied how the formation worked, how fighters positioned themselves relative to bombers, how altitude and sun position affected visibility, how German fighters chose when to attack and when to avoid engagement. His third mission, on October 21st, the Luftwaffe finally showed up. 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109s diving out of the sun, hitting the bomber formation from above. The P-51s broke to engage, and suddenly the sky was full of aircraft twisting and turning, trying to kill each other. Jimmy saw a Bf 109 positioning behind a P-51 flown by Lieutenant Hensley, the pilot who pulled too much negative G. Jimmy dove, building speed, closed to 300 yards and opened fire. 50 caliber rounds walked across the Messerschmitt's wing. The German pilot broke hard right, and Jimmy tried to follow, but the German was more experienced, knew his aircraft better, and Jimmy lost him in a climbing turn. When they landed, Hensley found Jimmy and shook his hand. "You saved my ass, Farmboy. Thanks." "You're pulling too much negative G in your dives," Jimmy said. "It's going to bend your airframe eventually." Hensley's smile faded. "I know how to fly my aircraft, thanks." Jimmy shut up. But he'd noticed something during that brief engagement. The Bf 109 pilot had expected Jimmy to follow standard pursuit tactics: maintain speed, maintain altitude, try to outturn the enemy. When Jimmy had lost him, it was because he'd flown predictably. The German pilot had anticipated his moves and countered them. Jimmy started thinking about what would happen if you didn't fly predictably. If you did something so unexpected, so apparently suicidal, that the enemy pilot couldn't anticipate it. Something that violated all the rules they taught in flight school. Something that only worked if you understood your aircraft at a level deeper than what the manuals described. He'd grown up on a farm where machinery failure meant financial ruin. He'd learned to push equipment to its limits without breaking it, to understand the difference between dangerous stress and catastrophic stress. He'd learned that sometimes the thing that looked like failure, a stall, a misfire, a loss of control, could be controlled, could be used, if you understood the underlying mechanics. An idea started forming. Dangerous, possibly stupid, but possible. Over the next 2 months, Jimmy flew 23 more combat missions. He got better at air combat, more confident. He scored his first confirmed kill in November, a Bf-109 that he caught in a climbing turn and shot down with a long deflection burst. He scored his second in December, another Bf-109 that made the mistake of trying to dive away from him. The P-51's one absolute advantage was dive speed, but he was still Farmboy to his squadron, still the outsider, the pilot who spent too much time with mechanics, who asked too many questions about aircraft performance envelopes, who didn't drink enough or joke enough or fit in enough. On January 14, 1945, everything changed. The mission was a fighter sweep over northern Germany, looking for targets of opportunity, German aircraft, trains, trucks, anything that could be destroyed. The weather was terrible, clouds from 8,000 to 15,000 feet, visibility less than a mile. Most of the squadron turned back. Jimmy and 3 others pressed on, looking for a gap in the clouds where they might find targets. They found targets, but the targets found them first. The 4 Messerschmitts came out of the cloud layer above them, like hawks dropping on rabbits. Jimmy saw them half a second before his flight leader did, but half a second wasn't enough. The German pilots were good, experienced, coordinated, flying the Bf-109 G14 variant that was faster and better armed than earlier models. They'd been hunting for exactly this, a small group of American fighters separated from their squadron, distracted, vulnerable. "Bandits high!" Jimmy called over the radio, but the attack was already happening. The lead Messerschmitt put a burst into the tail of Lieutenant Morrison's P-51. Morrison's aircraft shuddered, started trailing smoke, and went into a dive. Morrison's voice came over the radio, tight with pain. "I'm hit! Going down!" Then static. The other 2 P-51s broke in different directions, following trained responses. Never stay in a straight line when bounced from above. Jimmy broke hard left, pulling maximum G, his vision tunneling from the blood draining from his head. But the Germans were expecting this. 2 of them followed the other P-51s. 2 stayed with Jimmy. This was the problem with aerial combat that the training manuals didn't adequately address. When you're outnumbered and the enemy has the altitude advantage, standard tactics usually mean you die. You can run, try to dive away, use your speed to escape. But the Bf-109 G14 could follow a P-51 in a dive for long enough to get guns on target. You can try to outturn them, but that costs speed and energy, and eventually you stall or they get a deflection shot. The manual said, maintain energy, maintain options, try to extend the fight until help arrives. What the manuals didn't say, help probably isn't coming, and energy management only works if you have energy to manage. Jimmy dove, building speed. The 2 Messerschmitts dove after him. He pulled out at 4,000 feet hoping they'd overshoot, but they pulled out right behind him, closer now, maybe 400 yards. He could see them in his mirror. Dark green camouflage, yellow engine cowlings, propeller spinners that looked like predator teeth. He tried a brake turn, pulling hard right. The Germans split. One followed, the other climbed, setting up for a high-side pass. Standard tactics. They'd done this before, probably dozens of times. Teamwork perfected through experience. They were going to put Jimmy in a crossfire where any turn to avoid one put him in the sights of the other. Jimmy's mind raced through options. He couldn't outrun them. He'd already pushed his throttle to the firewall and they were still closing. He couldn't outturn them. The 109 could match the Mustang in turn radius at this altitude and speed. He couldn't climb. They had the altitude advantage and would intercept him. All the standard options led to the same result, being shot down. So he did something that wasn't standard. He chopped the throttle. In one sudden motion, Jimmy pulled the throttle back to idle, simultaneously pulling the nose up slightly. The P-51's airspeed bled off with shocking rapidity. 350 miles per hour. 300. 250. The Merlin engine's roar dropped to a muted rumble. Behind him, the trailing Messerschmitt pilot suddenly found himself closing on his target at a combined rate of nearly 200 miles per hour. In aerial combat, this is called overtaking velocity, and it's usually good. It means you're catching your prey. But in this case, it was too much too fast. The German pilot had been expecting Jimmy to maintain speed, to try to extend the fight. Instead, Jimmy was suddenly decelerating hard, and the Bf-109 was going to fly right past him. The German pilot did what instinct demanded. He tried to slow down. He pulled his throttle back, but the momentum of a 7,000-pound aircraft at 400 miles per hour. doesn't disappear instantly. The Messerschmitt shot past Jimmy's left wing, maybe 100 feet away, close enough that Jimmy could see the pilot's face turning toward him in surprise. The second Messerschmitt, the one that had been setting up the high side, pass, saw his wingman overshoot and reacted by diving down to press the attack himself. But Jimmy had already pushed his throttle forward again. The Merlin engine roared back to full power. The P-51 accelerated, not as fast as if he'd maintained speed, but fast enough. And now the geometry had changed. The German pilot who'd overshot was now in front of Jimmy, trying to pitch up and regain position. The German pilot diving from above was now too high, his angle wrong for a shot. And Jimmy, for just a few seconds, had changed from prey to predator. He didn't have long. Maybe 5 seconds before the Germans sorted themselves out and came at him again, this time ready for whatever trick he might try. So Jimmy did what his father had taught him with machinery that misbehaved. When you get an opening, you take it hard and you take it fast. He lined up on the Messerschmitt that had overshot, now about 300 yards ahead and climbing. The German pilot was pulling hard, trying to zoom climb and use his momentum to regain altitude advantage. It was the right move, the tactical move, but it also meant he was slow and his flight path was predictable. Jimmy's gunsight pipper settled on the 109's fuselage. He walked the rudder pedals to keep the pipper stable, despite the Mustang's slight yaw. His thumb found the gun trigger, 6 .50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, fired together with a hammering vibration that shook the entire aircraft. The tracers walked up the Messerschmitt's tail, across the rear fuselage, into the cockpit. The German aircraft staggered in the air like it had hit an invisible wall. Pieces came off, the canopy, chunks of the tail, something from the engine that tumbled away trailing smoke. The 109 rolled inverted and started down, trailing a thick stream of black smoke. One down, but one wasn't enough, and the other 3 were still very much alive and very much angry. Jimmy didn't wait to watch his kill impact the ground. He was already braking hard left, away from the second Messerschmitt that was diving toward him. That pilot had seen his wingman get shot down and was flying angry now, aggressive, no longer tactical. He was firing from too far out, maybe 500 yards, his rounds falling behind Jimmy's aircraft. Angry pilots make mistakes. But so do exhausted pilots, and Jimmy was running on adrenaline and borrowed time. His airspeed was low. He'd traded speed for that one kill, and now he didn't have the energy to run. The other 2 Messerschmitts, the ones who'd gone after his squadron mates, were turning back. Jimmy could see them in the distance, their profiles unmistakable. They'd either shot down the other P-51s or driven them off, and now they were coming to help their remaining wingman finish off the American. 3 Bf 109s, 1 P-51, low on speed, low on altitude, no help coming. The mathematics of aerial combat said Jimmy was dead. He thought about Morrison, who'd been shot down in the first seconds of the fight. Thought about his parents back in Kansas, who'd already lost one son to the war. Thought about the mechanics back at Leaston who'd treated him like an equal when the pilots treated him like a joke. Thought about how he'd spent his whole life being underestimated by people who thought they were smarter because they had better educations, better backgrounds, better breeding. And he thought about what his father had told him when he was 14 and trying to fix a tractor that 3 mechanics had declared unfixable. Son, sometimes the thing that looks broken is just working in a way people don't understand. Don't assume something can't work just because it's not working the way the manual says it should. Jimmy had done something in that brief moment when he'd chopped his throttle that violated every rule of aerial combat. You never voluntarily lose speed. You never let yourself get slow in a dogfight. Speed is life, energy is life, and giving up either is suicide. Except it hadn't been suicide. It had worked. For about 5 seconds, he'd done something so unexpected that experienced German pilots hadn't known how to respond. And in those 5 seconds, he'd changed from a victim to a victor. The question was, could he do it again? The 3 Messerschmitts were setting up a coordinated attack, positioning themselves at different altitudes and angles so that any move Jimmy made would put him in someone's gun sight. They were being careful now, communicating on their radios, planning. They'd seen what happened when they assumed this American pilot would follow standard tactics. Jimmy climbed, trying to gain some altitude, some energy. The Merlin engine was running perfectly. He could hear it, feel it through the airframe. Whatever else happened, his aircraft wasn't going to let him down. He'd maintained it well, had insisted the mechanics pay attention to details other pilots ignored. That care was paying off now. The lead Messerschmitt came in first, a high-side pass that forced Jimmy to brake. As he turned, the second 109 dove from above, trying to intercept his turn, and the third stayed high, waiting to see which way Jimmy would brake next. It was good tactics, patient, professional. The Germans had done this before. Jimmy broke down and right, away from the immediate threat, which put him on a converging course with the second attacker. The German pilot adjusted, leading the turn, his guns already spitting tracers. The rounds passed behind Jimmy's tail. The German had led too much, had assumed Jimmy would maintain his turn rate. Instead, Jimmy reversed, hard. He pulled the stick left and stomped the left rudder, forcing the P-51 into a barrel roll that bled speed dramatically, but changed his heading by 90 degrees in about 2 seconds. The German pilot shot past, his carefully planned interception turned into a miss by Jimmy's refusal to fly predictably. But the maneuver cost energy. Jimmy's airspeed dropped to 200 miles per hour, then 180. The P-51 was approaching stall speed, the speed below which the wings couldn't generate enough lift and the aircraft would fall from the sky. Every instinct trained into him screamed to push the nose down, gain speed, maintain control. Instead, he pulled the nose up higher. The airspeed indicator dropped to 160. The aircraft shuddered. The stall warning buffet vibrated through the control stick. He was on the edge, right on the edge of falling out of the sky. The third Messerschmitt, the one that had been waiting high, saw an opportunity too good to pass up. An American fighter stalling, virtually motionless relative to his own speed, unable to maneuver. The German pilot dove, building speed, his gun sight settling on what looked like a helpless target. He was building closing speed at maybe 250 miles per hour. In 5 seconds, he'd be in range for a sure kill. In 3 seconds, he'd be committed to his dive, too close to pull out without flying through his target's debris. Jimmy counted those seconds in his head. 1. The Messerschmitt grew larger in his mirror. 2. Closer now, the yellow propeller spinner clearly visible. 3. Jimmy kicked the right rudder hard, simultaneously letting the nose drop and pushing the throttle to firewall. The P-51 snap-rolled right and dove, falling away from its previous position like a stone. The stall that had been imminent half a second ago was now an advantage. The aircraft had so little forward speed that the roll happened almost around its vertical axis, dropping it away laterally and down instead of forward. The Messerschmitt pilot, committed to his dive, his guns already firing, found his target had disappeared. He'd been aiming at a specific point in space, a point his aircraft was now hurtling toward at 400 miles per hour with no target there. He tried to adjust, tried to pull up, but at that speed and that angle, physics limited his options. He flashed past the space where Jimmy had been, missing by maybe 50 feet, and Jimmy, now below him and accelerating in a dive, pulled the nose up slightly, tracked the climbing Messerschmitt with his gun sight, and fired. The burst lasted maybe 2 seconds, 650 caliber machine guns pouring rounds into the Messerschmitt's belly as it climbed away. Jimmy saw strikes walking from the tail forward, saw pieces coming off, saw smoke, then fire. The German pilot ejected, a dark shape tumbling through the air as his aircraft continued climbing for another 1,000 feet before rolling over and falling. 2 down, 2 remaining. And Jimmy was out of clever tricks, out of energy, out of altitude. He was at 2,000 feet, airspeed building again as he pulled out of his dive, but the other 2 Messerschmitts were still above him and they were done playing. They came in together, one from each side, coordinating their attack to eliminate his options. Jimmy did the only thing he could. He dove for the deck, pushing his aircraft toward the ground at full throttle. The Merlin engine screamed. The airspeed indicator climbed past 450 miles per hour. The airframe vibrated with the strain. But the P-51 was built for this, designed for high-speed diving, and it held together. The 2 Messerschmitts followed, but they couldn't catch him. The P-51's advantage in dive speed was absolute. By the time Jimmy pulled out at 500 feet, skimming over German farmland fast enough that trees and houses were a blur, the Messerschmitts were 1,000 feet behind and falling back further. They broke off the pursuit. 2 of their flight were dead, and chasing this insane American pilot who flew like no one they'd ever encountered wasn't worth losing more aircraft. They climbed back toward altitude and headed east, toward their base, while Jimmy turned west toward England. The flight back was the longest 2 hours of his life. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature at altitude. He kept checking his mirrors, expecting more German fighters, but none came. He crossed the channel alone, landed at Leiston alone, and taxied to his hardstand where the ground crew was waiting. They'd heard Morrison's last radio call. They knew Jimmy's flight had been hit. They'd been watching for 4 aircraft to return, hoping all 4 made it, prepared to count how many came back. When they saw one P-51 approaching, landing gear down, they'd assumed the worst. Jimmy climbed out of the cockpit and his legs nearly gave out. The crew chief caught him, helped him sit on the wing. "Where are the others?" the crew chief asked. "Morrison went down early. Don't know about the other 2. Didn't see them after the first minute." Jimmy's voice was flat, exhausted. "And you? How'd you get away?" Jimmy looked at his P-51, at the aircraft that had done everything he'd asked, despite being pushed to limits the manual said were dangerous. "I did something stupid," he said, "but it worked." When he gave his debrief to the intelligence officer, he tried to explain what he'd done. The throttle chop to force an overshoot, the deliberate approach to stall speed to set up a snap roll, the use of the stall itself as a defensive maneuver. The intelligence officer listened, made notes, and asked careful questions. "You're claiming 2 confirmed kills?" "Yes, sir. Both Bf-109s, both went down." "Gun camera footage will confirm this?" "Should, sir." The intelligence officer studied Jimmy for a long moment. "Lieutenant, what you're describing, deliberately stalling your aircraft in combat, that's explicitly forbidden in tactical doctrine. Stalls kill pilots. You understand that?" "Yes, sir, but I wasn't fully stalling. I was approaching stall speed, controlling it. There's a difference." "The difference being?" "The difference being I'm alive and 2 German pilots aren't." The gun camera footage was developed that evening. It showed exactly what Jimmy had described. 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109s shot down in circumstances that seemed impossible. The footage was reviewed by the squadron commander, the group commander, and eventually by tactical analysts at higher headquarters who wanted to understand how a single outnumbered P-51 had defeated 4 German fighters flown by experienced pilots. Word spread through the squadron. The other pilots, the ones who'd called him Farmboy, who'd treated him like an unsophisticated outsider, suddenly wanted to know how he'd done it. Jimmy tried to explain, but most of them didn't understand. They thought in terms of speed and altitude and angles of attack, the way they'd been taught in flight school. They didn't think in terms of machinery at its limits, of understanding an aircraft so completely that you could make it do things the manual said were impossible. "You could have died," one pilot said. "That stall trick, you were seconds from falling out of the sky." "I grew up around machinery," Jimmy said. "You learn where the real limits are versus where people think the limits are. They're not always the same thing." Over the next 2 months, Jimmy flew 15 more combat missions. He didn't use his stall trick again. It only worked when the enemy wasn't expecting it, and word had spread through the Luftwaffe about an American pilot who flew erratically. But he used the principles behind it: unpredictability, using apparent weakness as strength, understanding his aircraft better than the enemy understood theirs. He shot down 3 more German aircraft before the war ended in May 1945, 5 total kills, making him an ace. Not the squadron's highest scoring ace, but one of the few who'd survived outnumbered odds through unconventional thinking. When the war in Europe ended, Jimmy returned to the United States. He considered leaving the military, but he loved flying too much. He stayed in, transitioned to jets, and when the Korean War began in 1950, he was ready. Korea was different from World War II. The aircraft were jets now. F-86 Sabres versus Soviet-built MiG-15s. The speeds were higher, the altitudes were higher, everything happened faster. But the principles of air combat remained: energy management, tactics, understanding your aircraft better than the enemy understood theirs. On May 20th, 1951, Captain James Jabara became the world's first jet ace, shooting down his 5th and 6th MiG-15s in a single engagement. He would eventually score 15 kills in Korea, making him one of the war's top aces. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross with multiple clusters. The farm boy from Kansas had become one of the most successful fighter pilots in American history. But it was that day in January 1945, alone over Germany, outnumbered 4-1, that defined everything that came after. That was the day Jimmy proved that unconventional thinking, that understanding machinery at a fundamental level, that refusing to accept that the manual contained all possible solutions, those things could mean the difference between life and death. The stall trick he'd used became legend. The Air Force studied it, analyzed it, eventually incorporated elements of it into advanced fighter tactics. The modern flat scissors maneuver, where fighters deliberately bleed speed to force an overshoot, owes something to what Jimmy figured out over German farmland while fighting for his life. The concept of post-stall maneuvering that modern fighters like the F-22 Raptor can perform is an extension of the same principle, using apparent loss of control as a tactical advantage. Jimmy never claimed to have invented anything. He always said he'd just done what made sense at the time, using what he'd learned growing up around machinery. But in doing so, he'd changed how people thought about air combat. He'd proven that the limits in the manual weren't necessarily the actual limits, that sometimes survival required doing things that looked suicidal to people who didn't understand the underlying mechanics. He retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 1966 after 25 years of service. He'd flown in 2 wars, accumulated thousands of flight hours, trained new generations of fighter pilots. He'd gone from being Farmboy to being Colonel James Jabara, ace of 2 wars, recipient of multiple decorations, pioneer of jet combat tactics. But he never forgot where he'd come from. He never forgot the farm in Kansas, the tractors he'd repaired, the machinery he'd understood before he understood aircraft. He never forgot the squadron mates who'd underestimated him because of his background. And he never forgot that day over Germany when everything they'd taught him in flight school said he should die, and he'd survived because he knew something they hadn't taught him. That sometimes the thing that looks like failure is just working in a way people don't expect. Jimmy died in a car accident in 1966, just months after his retirement. He was 43 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds, fellow pilots, mechanics who'd worked on his aircraft, commanders who'd recognized his talent even when others hadn't. They buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The citation on his Distinguished Service Cross, awarded for his actions in Korea, could just as easily have been written about that day in 1945. Captain Jabara's brilliant airmanship, his aggressive determination, and devotion to duty reflected great credit upon himself, his organization, and the United States Air Force. But the mechanics who'd worked with him, who'd seen him in the hangars late at night studying his aircraft, who'd heard him talk about machinery with the reverence some people reserve for religion, they understood something the citation didn't capture. Jimmy hadn't just been a good pilot. He'd been someone who understood at a fundamental level how things worked, who refused to accept that expertise required formal education, who proved that growing up fixing tractors could teach you things about flying that academies never could. Modern fighter pilots still study Jimmy Jabara. They study his tactics, his innovations, his willingness to do the unexpected. But they don't always understand where those innovations came from. They don't always realize that the foundation of his success was laid in wheat fields in Kansas, in barns where he'd taken apart engines and rebuilt them, in conversations with his father about the difference between what the manual said machinery could do and what machinery could actually do if you understood it completely. The farm boy they'd mocked became a legend. The pilot they'd underestimated became an ace twice over. The outsider who didn't fit in rewrote the rules of air combat. And all of it started because he'd grown up understanding that machinery, whether it was a tractor or a fighter plane, responded to someone who understood it deeply, who could feel when it was approaching its limits, who knew the difference between dangerous and impossible. That's the story of James Jabara, the farm boy who became the world's first jet ace, the pilot who proved that formal education isn't the only path to expertise, the man who did something that looked suicidal and survived because he understood his aircraft better than anyone thought possible. They mocked him. They called him Farm Boy. They assumed he didn't belong. And then he saved his own life by doing something none of them could do, something none of them had even imagined doing. He turned apparent weakness into strength. He used the one thing they'd mocked him for, his mechanical intuition from growing up on a farm, and turned it into the advantage that kept him alive. The next time you hear someone dismiss someone else because of their background, because they don't have the right education or the right pedigree or the right accent. Remember Jimmy Jabara. Remember that expertise comes in many forms. Remember that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the person who changes everything.